On March 13, 1945, while attacking convoy FS-1753, midget submarine Sehund sank transport vessel Tabor Park, which had a displacement of around 3,000 tons. It was the first combat raid for submarine commander Max Huber and engineer Siegfried Eckloff, and they were awarded the Iron Cross First Class for conducting it. It goes without saying that the triumph encouraged the officers, who soon set out on their next mission in the North Sea. The memories of Lieutenant Eckloff about that raid serve as the basis of our story. We were shocked by what we saw when we surfaced at night. The sea around the sub was filled with magnificent shining beauty. A fiery green trail stretched along our sub's wake. Water droplets sparkled on the deck and conning tower like diamonds.
Gegen Ende des Zweiten Weltkrieges war es nicht mehr möglich,
By the end of World War II, it was highly difficult for standard submarines to disrupt Allied communication lines in British waters. The Kriegsmarine Shipbuilding Department received an order to create a midget submarine with a crew of 2 people. This would enable them to supply the maximum number of submarines to the Navy within a short time frame.
Kurzer Zeit an die Front geschickt werden konnte mit möglichst großen Zahlen.
Midget submarine Sehund first served in Diversion and Assault Task Force K of the Navy in December 1944. The task force had been formed a year prior, and its objective was to conduct operations against enemy units in coastal areas.
Alle anderen Projekte der Kriegsmarine für sogenannte
All other miniature projects of the Navy supposed the implementation of submerging or surface-based one-man vehicles.
Dies hier, der Sehund.
Sehund wasn't only the largest of the midget submarines, she also had a 2-man crew. That represented a decisive advantage, because a sole person in a vehicle with dimensions slightly larger than those of a torpedo could rely only on themselves. The person would be entirely alone during a mission, and therefore in great danger.
The sea was gleaming with fantastic illumination. However, we were soon reminded of the wartime reality. A convoy showed up along the course, its ships also leaving wide glistening trails behind them as they went. We shifted to combat duty and launched a torpedo, but unfortunately it missed. The glow from the sea prevented the commander from determining the target parameters and course correctly. The ships were much closer to us than we expected, so we had to sharply turn to the side in order to avoid a collision. We submerged and hit the sea floor, regretting the missed chance. Performance characteristics of midget submarine Sehund. Length almost 12 meters, beam 1.7 meters, draft 1.54 meters, underwater displacement almost 17 tons. She's a side tank submarine, diameter of her sturdy hull 1.28 meters. Armament: 2 G7E electric torpedoes, caliber 533 mm.
Aus Gewichtsgründen eine von 2
To conserve some weight, one of 2 electric batteries was removed from the torpedoes.
Dadurch war also sowohl die Laufstrecke als auch
The torpedoes, if the battery was fully charged, traveled at a speed of around 18 knots or 18 naval miles per hour, and had a cruising range of around 5,000 meters.
Auf eine Entfernung von ungefähr 5.000 Meter oder 4.800 Meter, wenn die Batterien frisch waren.
Propulsion: diesel engine 60 horsepower, electric engine 25 horsepower. 8 groups of storage batteries with a 1,600 ampere per hour capacity.
Und zwar in unserem Fall war der Hersteller die Firma Büssing in Braunschweig.
These diesel engines were mass manufactured by Büssing in Braunschweig and other cities across Germany, and used primarily in buses and trucks.
Für den Zweck im Seehund musste der Motor, der ursprünglich 100 PS
To use the engine for Sehund, its power, which was initially 100 horsepower, needed to be lowered, otherwise the sub would plow due to the shape of her hull.
Seehund wäre dann untergeschnitten.
Top speed 8 knots while surfaced, 6 knots while underwater. Operational depth 30 meters. Cruising range 270 miles at a 7-knot speed while surfaced. Several hours later, when we were eating, we heard 3 distant explosions of depth charges. 30 minutes later, we heard 3 more explosions. The explosions repeated regularly every 30 minutes. Finally, we decided to surface to inspect the situation. The weather was bright, but a thick, impenetrable fog was hanging over the water. The fog finally dissipated at around 10 a.m. Observing from a tiny conning tower, we were more surprised than shocked by what we saw. There was a British destroyer a mile away from us that was drifting as we were. At that moment, 30 minutes since the last explosions had elapsed. We could see through binoculars how the English sailors were performing preparations on the deck. Then the destroyer suddenly moved full ahead, and the sailors started dropping depth charges from the rear. Then the destroyer stopped and started drifting again. They were obviously listening to the sounds below them. We were discussing an attack plan when the destroyer suddenly started moving, turned around, and headed towards us at full speed. We submerged and moved to the side, underwater.
Der Tauchvorgang des Seehundes war
Sehund could submerge very quickly.
realisieren. Der Seehund brauchte ungefähr
It took between 5 to 8 seconds.
Sekunden, direkt unter Wasser zu kommen.
Upon the commander's order, both crew members simultaneously activated the system that filled the main ballast tanks. Then the engineer would shift the horizontal rudders to the submerged position.
Dann war das Boot in 5 Sekunden unter der Wasseroberfläche.
In case of an emergency dive, the diesel engine wasn't turned off by the crew and could continue operating until the sub reached a depth of 15 to 17 meters, thanks to the exhaust gases being ejected into the exterior water through a special 2-atmosphere pressure valve. It might seem that during these seconds while the sub was submerging, the fact of the diesel engine using the air from the interior of the sub might kill the crew. However, an experiment demonstrated that when the crew began suffering from elevated heart rates, ringing in the ears, and a lack of air, the diesel engine also stopped functioning due to the lack of air. In reality, of course, the engineer usually switched to the electric engine much sooner. The first bomb starting exploding near our sub 5 minutes later. A thermos bottle with tea was the first thing to shatter. A disgusting squeaking sound caused by the shards scattered all around the sub was definitely heard on the surface. However, it was all quiet there for some time, but we knew what that meant. The destroyer had stopped and was listening. We carefully touched down on the sea bottom with our sub and waited. We didn't even dare to cough or say a couple of words. As we had predicted already, 30 minutes later, we heard the loud noise of the destroyer starting to move. Almost at the same time, gruesome hits descended upon our sub. Our equipment was destroyed in rapid sequence. After the third hit, a horrific and oppressive silence enshrouded the submarine.
Im Übrigen, mit diesem
Submarine Sehund was basically a standard submarine, just smaller in size. But she noticeably outclassed any other military miniature submersibles. Sehund submarines could perform combat raids for periods of several days to a week or more, while other miniature combat units weren't capable of this.
Waiting for next explosions was even more tiresome because the quality of the air inside the submarine was deteriorating rapidly. We didn't turn the automatic ventilation system on since we were afraid that its noise would surely give away our exact location to the destroyer. 30 minutes later, the familiar procedure was repeated again on the surface. The noise of destroyers' receding propellers followed by deafening explosions of depth charges. That time, the shockwave of an explosion slammed the sub harder. I was hit against the sidewall. The lights went out, everything was squeaking around, and water started getting inside the submarine. The situation became critical, so we decided to turn the ventilation system on, since they could hear us on the surface anyway. A mass of depth charges came down from above immediately. The enemy wasn't waiting anymore. They just blanketed us with bombs. If we didn't manage to quickly move out, the much-hyped robustness of Sehund wouldn't save us. Thanks to her dimensions, Sehund was almost invisible to radar in her surfaced position and hardly detectable for hydrophones while underwater. It was much harder to hit a small Sehund with depth charges than submarines of a standard size. She was often just knocked away by the shockwave of an explosion. A case occurred where a badly damaged Sehund managed to return to base after 259 depth charges had been dropped on the submarine in the combat area. I turned the emergency light on. The water level inside the sub was rising. Ampere meters and voltmeters cracked, and the magnetic compass was broken. The manometer displayed an impossible air pressure of 1,500 millibars, thus indicating that it was faulty. To make matters worse, the sub suddenly capsized and started rolling along the bottom. At first, it seemed like somebody had hooked Sehund with a steel rope or net and was pulling her like a huge fish. The sub was rolling, shaking, hitting rocks, bouncing and tumbling along the sea bottom. But it was a miracle. The destroyer didn't respond to that. There was no further bombing. We came to the conclusion that our sub had been moved by a depth current, while our pursuer might have been moved in the opposite direction by a surface current. Anyway, it became clear to us that we could use the current which was carrying the submarine to get us to the surface by inertia using the rudders. We simultaneously grabbed the levers of the parallel connected rudders, but they hardly moved. They were jammed. It meant that we had also lost control.
The commander was responsible for navigation. As a rule, the commander was a young officer, a lieutenant who had just recently graduated from the academy. The engineer was a junior engineering lieutenant or chief mechanic, also called a senior under-officer. In some cases, such under-officers became commanders. They were the most experienced navigation officers.
I had been working and sweating in a tight compartment for 90 minutes before I finally decided to disconnect both rudders. My rudder started turning, albeit with the application of great effort. Meanwhile, the depth current had vanished. The submarine was lying on the bottom, motionless. I thought that if the compressed air module had failed or the ballast tanks had leaked air due to the damage, we were doomed to die stranded on the sea bottom. I started blowing the tanks, and Sehund didn't fail. She began to quickly ascend to the surface. The water that had leaked in moved to the rear compartments, causing Sehund to surface in an almost vertical position. As we discovered on the surface, the damage taken by the sturdy hull seemed insignificant. We easily pumped out the water that had leaked in, the batteries made contact again, and the diesel engine started after the water was removed. Some time later, when Sehund was in good condition again, if we don't mention broken devices inside the sub, and ready to sail, we plotted our course home.
We don't know what the largest target sunk by a Sehund was, but we can suppose that the largest attacked and sunk ships had dimensions similar to those of Liberty vessels. In other words, around 7,500 gross registered tons. Other ships might have been smaller, we just don't know their dimensions.
We felt ill at ease only the next morning when our sub was taken out of the water. The technicians looked at us as if we had just returned from the other side. Our Sehund looked more like a pile of scrap than a submarine. The plating in many places was torn off, and the conning tower had been pushed inside by 4 centimeters. Her sturdy hull had been turned into something similar to a crushed bucket that had been walked over by hundreds of feet, wearing boots with iron horseshoes. When the first crews of Sehund submarines began training in the fall of 1944, many of them understood that the defeat to the Third Reich was inevitable. The only remaining hope was a wonder weapon that was promised to the nation by Goebbels and Hitler. One of the young submarine cadets asked their K Task Force commander, Vice Admiral Hay, when they would get that wonder weapon. The Admiral looked at the future crews of the midget submarine and answered, "You are our wonder weapon."
Von diesem Typ wurden insgesamt 205
In total, 285 submarines of that class were built.
Da die Akten über die Einsätze
But not all of them were commissioned into service. Since the documentation has mostly been lost, we can only speculate about the reasons behind that. According to the data I possess, only 70 to 90 submarines saw combat.
137 Sehund-class midget submarines entered service in the Kriegsmarine. In the period from January to May 1945, they performed 142 combat raids and sank at least 9 Allied vessels. At the same time, 35 subs were lost. 2/3 of them were lost for reasons that didn't involve combat. The Allies had to utilize 500 ships and 1,500 airplanes in the fight against the German midget submarines. Sehund was the most successful midget submarine of World War II. She demonstrated her high efficiency in just 4 months of active combat. In reality, the Allies were very lucky that the Kriegsmarine started using midget submarines only at the end of the war. The Germans simply didn't have time to fully realize their potential. After the war, a German submarine veteran recalled in an interview how their Sehund had been detected and how they had hidden at the bottom of the English Channel. Over the course of several hours, the crew of the Sehund lying on the seafloor counted at least a couple of hundred Allied vessels passing over them. It was a vast convoy that they weren't able to attack. That was the moment when the veteran realized that Germany had no chance of winning the war.
Sailors, stay calm.
Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.